All right, welcome everyone to Passing the Baton for Wilderness, its role in national forest planning, landscape level protections, and 30 by 30 with our keynote presenter, Ed Zahniser. And this webinar this evening is in association with the Wyoming Wilderness Association and the Wilderness Society. My name is Peggy DePasquale, and I am the Associate Director at the Wyoming Wilderness Association. And so grateful to both the Wilderness Society and Ed Zahniser for joining us in this presentation tonight. So next slide. What you can expect over the next hour, we're going to go over a really quick Zoom 101 for anyone who isn't familiar with this platform or who's never been in a webinar version of Zoom before. We'll go over kind of how to engage as an audience and when you can expect what. We will then move into an overview of work and mission. First, we'll hear from the Wilderness Society about what they're up to, and then you'll hear a little bit about my work with the Wyoming Wilderness Association. And then we will give Ed Zahniser an introduction, and he will give our keynote portion of the evening, Passing the Baton for Wilderness. We will wrap up with plenty of time for questions, so please, as you're listening in, think about things that you would like to learn more about or have us expand on, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for all three of the presenters to answer the questions that you might have. All right, next slide. So Zoom 101. We've all spent a lot of time on Zoom this year, but please know that this presentation is being recorded. So if you want to hear something again or share the presentation with someone that you know and you think will also enjoy it, know that we will be recording it and then sharing it out on social media. You can expect that following the presentation, you will all get an email with contact information for Wyoming Wilderness Association and the Wilderness Society, a link to the presentation, and more information on how you can get involved in some of the awesome stuff you'll be learning about tonight. If you have questions as the presentation is going, please go to the bottom and look at your little toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and you'll see a little chat box. And if you hit that chat box, a panel will come up and you can type questions in. And Wyoming Wilderness Association's Communications Director, JJ McGinnis, is on the call with us, and he's going to be behind the scenes fielding questions and bringing questions up at an appropriate time that come into the chat box. So if you have questions that come up and you want to ask them as the presenter is going, please do just use the chat box to do that. After Ed has wrapped up his portion of the evening, we'll move into a live Q&A section. And the way that we will open the floor is that you can all just unmute yourself at that point. So if you go down to that bottom toolbar again, you'll see that icon. And right now you're all muted. The little microphone will have a line through it. If you just click on that icon with your mouse, you will go unmuted and you can ask your question out loud. And of course, you'll all be biting at the bit to do that. So when you do unmute yourself, if you kind of overlap with someone else, just wait a minute and we will figure out how to make sure that everyone can ask their question out loud and have a live discussion with our presenters. And if you have any questions on how to do this, you can also use the chat box to ask questions and get further assistance or clarity on how this whole thing works. But mostly we just encourage you to sit back and enjoy, listen, and learn with us all tonight. And now that I've given Zoom 101, I'm really excited to hand the floor over to the director of the Wyoming director at the Wilderness Society, Dan Smitherman. He is an incredible partner on wilderness issues, a longtime backcountry outfitter, wilderness advocate, and friend. So I'll pass it over to Dan to give you a little bit of insight on the Wilderness Society.
Next slide. Thanks, Peggy. I appreciate the introduction. And welcome to everybody who's on the Zoom call tonight. I'm going to give you not a complete description of everything we're doing, but kind of a quick and dirty on some of our new stuff as it relates to landscape conservation. And we'll be happy to answer questions, as Peggy mentioned. At the end, about 2 years ago, TWS started a process to re-strategize and revisionize what we did over the next 10 years. And out of this new strategic vision, which we're in the process of implementing now, we came up with two new priorities. And the first one was addressing climate and extinction crises. And the three key strategies to addressing this particular issue at TWS was connecting critical landscapes, the 30 by 30 initiative, and reforming land management to provide more protection for landscapes. Next slide. We decided to do it on a landscape scale, and that word is tossed around a lot. But what landscape scale means to the Wilderness Society is an area that's large enough, and it's generally in the greater than 1 to 10 million acres, and wild enough that it can incorporate movements and habit requirements for various species, and big enough for ecological processes that sustain those species to carry out. It also contains a variety of land management objectives and ownership. It could include private lands, it could include public lands, it could include protected lands and unprotected lands. It also has access for diverse human cultures, indigenous Americans, people of color, et cetera, et cetera. And we focused these landscapes on three key elements: the biodiversity that it potentially contained, the connectivity, and how wild it was. Next slide. "30 by 30 is a key strategy for our work on landscapes. And basically, protecting 30% of the U.S. land by 2030 is a part of a solution to three crises that we're looking at: climate, access to nature, and species loss. But 30 by 30 requires collaboration. It needs to work across state and local government. It needs to work across various landowners, indigenous tribes, recreation groups, scientists, and the community. And the focus of 30 by 30, in spite of what you may have read in the newspaper, is on collaboration. And we look in Wyoming specifically that the ranchers and the farmers and private landowners are a very important part of the 30 by 30 initiative. For years and multi-generations, these people have, provided conservation on private land. And 30 by 30 is a way to bring them into the picture, provide resources and toolboxes that allows them to make preserving their lands for future generations a priority. It's all about working with landowners. And it's also an opportunity for Wyoming and other states to secure resources that allow for restoration of habitat, for wildlife programs like protecting migration corridors, to support outdoor recreation and support access. And all these support conservation goals. And wilderness plays a key role in this 30 by 30 effort. And 30 by 30 is not a land grab. It's not an attempt by the federal government to own more acres of land. It's an attempt to protect land across multiple ownership for future generations. Next slide. Wilderness, how wilderness fits. We always get the question, well, why wilderness and how does wilderness fit? In this context, there's several points, and I'll point out three of them. Wilderness is the top of the triangle, the top of the barrel for public land protection. It provides the highest level of protection among a varied suite of protections. It's also the most durable protection for our wildest and most pristine landscapes because of the legislation in the 1964 Wilderness Act, which I'm sure Ed's going to talk about a little bit. The other thing that wilderness does is it helps nature and ecosystem health be restored and maintained by conserving and connecting large parcels of land. It provides sanctuary for wildlife, it provides connectivity, it protects migration corridors, and it acts as a buffer against climate change. So wilderness is very much a part of 30 by 30 and landscape area protections. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Peggy, and she's going to tell you about the tremendous work that WWA is doing in Wyoming.
Thank you so much, Dan. So as Dan said, Wyoming Wilderness Association is working right here in Wyoming. And although The Wilderness Society and Wyoming Wilderness Association both share the same middle name. We are totally different groups working on a very similar issue. And I think we do a really good job at kind of highlighting the work of each other and working on a team. We are grassroots, and our mission is to protect Wyoming public wildlands through education. So we have students of all ages out in the landscapes we're working to protect, and inspiring them to find their voice as wilderness advocates. We're also leading stewardship efforts. So we are doing data collection, trail work, just serving as a partner and support to our agencies that are tasked with managing these public wildlands across the state of Wyoming. And third, but certainly not least, we are advocates. So we are working on policy and management decisions that will ensure that these wild places in the state of Wyoming are protected for generations to come. And we define wildlands. A lot of people say, well, that's not wilderness. What does wildlands mean? And when it comes to my work on national forest land, wildlands are defined as any lands already designated as wilderness study areas, and any roadless land that could one day possibly be designated as wilderness. Our mission is to ensure those wilderness characteristics are maintained and protected. Next slide. So as I mentioned, my role in the northwest corner of Wyoming is really focused on forest planning. And similar to Dan's presentation, I cannot possibly tell you about all of the different things that WWA is working on, but I encourage you all to look into our work across the state. This presentation is going to focus on our priority of forest planning. And the reason that forest planning is our priority and wilderness is so key to it is that the Bridger-Teton National Forest, 3.4 million acres in the northwest corner of the state, is due to have their forest plan revised. And a forest this wild deserves a really good forest plan. So what is a forest plan? It's a comprehensive document that dictates what uses can occur across the forest and where. It outlines how resources will be managed and protected. And this includes all of those things that WWA cares so much about, which is wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, and inventoried wilderness areas. All of those are included in a forest plan, and their future is decided by how strong this forest plan is. And so we take these planning measures very, very seriously. It also provides an opportunity to recommend new wilderness. On the Bighorn National Forest, we successfully recommended the Rock Creek recommended wilderness area as wilderness. And we think of that as one of the biggest wins in our history, in addition to the Wyoming Wilderness Act of 1984, of course. But Ed has a t-shirt on today that celebrates that landscape. And that was an outcome of a forest planning effort. And we're really excited about opportunities to recommend new wilderness. Of course, designated wilderness only comes through a congressional action. So forest planning does not designate new wilderness, but the agency can recommend lands that deserve that protection in the future. And that's a really important step in the work we do to protect Wyoming public wildlands. Important to note is that a forest plan is supposed to occur roughly every 15 years, but the Bridger-Teton has been 31 years since its plan was revised. So really important science and understanding has kind of been left out of the management that we're seeing on the ground. So groups are really eager to see this plan revised, and the Wilderness Society and WWA are working really hard to make sure that we are prepared for when the revision finally kicks off. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the Bridger-Teton. I think so often we talk about these places and it's hard to visualize what we mean, but these are the 3.4 million acres in the northwest corner of the state. And you kind of see that little 4-state map of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Utah. And you can see just what a large portion of Wyoming we're talking about. And when you consider how wild it is, it absolutely rises to the top as an important landscape. And I bet many of you, if you've traveled to Wyoming, have come in close contact, if not driven through this forest, and know just how special it is. Thank you. Next slide. And because I imagine a lot of you have experiences near or in the national forest, and hopefully will take our word for just what an important forest it is if you haven't, Also, understand that your voice is really important in forest planning and the management of all of our public lands. Forest planning is a public process, and that means that your input and what you have to say and what you think should happen on this forest is absolutely foundational to the outcomes there. Our National Forest Agency partners, they manage these lands for the greatest good, and they're not able to know what the greatest good is if they don't hear from the public and know what we want. So please consider how you are going to get engaged. And one thing that I think is a best practice is that strong relationships go so far. If you write a letter and they have no idea who you are, it will be heard and it will be accounted for. But if you go out of your way to build trust and rapport with different people at the National Forest, especially those that will eventually come on and be a part of the planning team, your input and passion will go a lot further. So think about how you might be able to build relationships with the National Forest. Know that the nonprofit partners working on this are doing the same, and know that communicate early and often. Although there will be comment periods where your voice will be most meaningful, that doesn't mean you shouldn't start reaching out and having conversations now. Next slide, please. And coming back to that question, Dan posed it as two groups of, as I said, wilderness is our middle names. Like, why do we think wilderness is the answer and such an important part of the solution for these lands? Three of the things that keep me passionate about wilderness advocacy. The first is it's the only land designation that ensures natural processes will be allowed to continue untrammeled, meaning unheld back or unmanipulated by all of the different things that humans like to do to try and control and change the way that our earth operates. And wilderness is the one place that we can be sure that all of the natural processes are allowed to continue as they'd like. It also protects the few fragments of wild country where we as a people can go out and experience this place before Euro-American development swept the country, and all of the modern conveniences that rule our everyday life are no longer at play, and we can kind of leave them behind and find solitude and escape into these wild places. And it's rooted in the ethic that the natural world has value in and of itself. I think so often we kind of always look through the lens of what can it do for people, but sometimes it's important to take a step back and say that place deserves to stay wild because it deserves to stay wild for its own sake. And those are three of the reasons that keeps me passionate, but I'm sure we all have our reasons. And next slide, please. You know, I think Dan and I can communicate the good work we're doing to advocate for wilderness, but some people say it better than anyone else about why wilderness is so important. And that's why we're so excited to have Ed Zahniser here to talk about passing the baton for wilderness and why it is still more relevant than ever, whether it's for the Wilderness Society's work with 30 by 30 or landscape level protection or Wyoming Wilderness Association's efforts with forest planning. Wilderness is still an integral part. And I'm really excited to welcome Ed Zahniser, son of Howard Zahniser, who is a name we should all be familiar with since he is the chief architect of the 1964 National Wilderness Preservation System Act, which started the wilderness, well, it didn't start it, but was one of the most incredible milestones in protecting wilderness across the country in 1964. Ed Zahniser is the youngest of 4 children of Howard and Alice Zahniser, and has spent his incredible life exploring many of the wild places that our two organizations work so hard to protect today. Ed retired in 2013 after serving as the senior writer and editor for the publications group of the National Park Service. Since the early 1990s, he's given more than 60 talks, trainings, and presentations throughout the United States on wilderness and on the work of his father. Ed is also the editor and contributor to the book Where Wilderness Preservation Began, Adirondack Writings of Howard Zahniser, and is also the author of several books and chapbooks of poetry. And we are so fortunate to have him with us today to share his insights on passing the baton for wilderness. So Ed, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks to Peggy and Dan for inviting me to share some thoughts on wilderness with you. And thanks to each of you for doing the important work of your Wyoming Wilderness Association and the Wilderness Society, and those we hope will get on board with both those organizations and start actively working for wilderness. I was 3 times an employee of the Wilderness Society in the 1960s and 1970s. And earlier as a child and young teen, I did multi-hand insert folding and inserting of hundreds and hundreds of Wilderness Society mailings, kneeling at our piano bench in our home in Hyattsville, Maryland, and where we lived in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. It was there that my father hand wrote the first draft of the Wilderness Act at our dining room table. My mother, Alice, typed it up for efficiency's sake because she typed using 8 fingers and her thumbs. And my father typed using only his 2 index fingers throughout. In the important overview presentation of the work of the Wilderness Society and the Wyoming Wilderness Association, we heard about the landscape focus of land preservation and President Biden's 30 by 30 program. We heard how wilderness figures in these initiatives and the importance of community voice, and the whole of the United States is the community in this case. Now imagine with me that we are here grasping the baton for wilderness and wildness from all our forerunners to make good on our laps of this great relay race. Our goal is to preserve these wildlands to which, as Brett Wallach has written, quote, progress would otherwise show no mercy. As Peggy said, forest planning does not achieve the level of protection that the Wilderness Act does. Only Congress can do that. But forest protection takes wildlands one step closer to that ultimate land protection. Wilderness designation is the ultimate land protection that we all need to be fighting for. It's the protection we take up the baton for, and this our great legacy of work for wilderness. Indeed, 86%, as Peggy mentioned, of the Bridger-Teton National Forest is roadless land. The Wilderness Act really offers a redefinition of progress, whose history hooks back to the transcendentalists in the mid-1800s, to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Sarah Fuller, and Henry David Thoreau. The Wilderness Act took its urgency from the proliferation of automobiles after World War II. Robert Marshall and others in the 1920s and 30s had begun talking of protecting, quote, roadless areas and, quote, primitive areas from being roaded. Historian Paul Sutter's book about the early wilderness movement is titled Driven Wild: How the Fight Against Automobiles Launched the Modern Wilderness Movement. So I hope we can do 3 things here this evening. First, see wilderness as a longtime concern of the American people for the fate of our legacy of federal public domain lands. And second, look at what my father, Howard Zahniser, thought about the role of wilderness in our civilization, how wilderness can help us discover ourselves as dependent and interdependent members of the whole community of life on Earth. And third, put wilderness in the context of state and federal public lands conservation history. These are foundational for messaging about wilderness in our work with the public, opinion makers, agency folk, and lawmakers. So here's our big idea. When advocating wilderness, we can lay our message's foundations in our nation's public lands conservation history. Wilderness preservation became the 20th century expression of the 18th and 19th century determination of the American people to conserve or to preserve, to protect in their natural state, remnants of our once vast federal public lands. These are lands to which, as Brett Wallach writes, progress would otherwise show no mercy. The urge to preserve wilderness was not a 20th century idea. The urge to preserve wilderness did not get its start with the first wilderness bill in Congress in 1956 or in the 1930s even with Robert Marshall and founding of the Wilderness Society. Concern for wilderness dates back at least to the first half of the 19th century. The 1964 Wilderness Act simply capped a progression of American attempts to protect remnants of our federal public domain lands in their natural state. There have been three big conservation movements: a forest movement, a parks movement, and the wilderness preservation movement. All three continue today. But as movements to preserve wild nature on federal public lands, the forest movement was co-opted. Then the parks movement was co-opted. So conservationists tried again with the 1964 Wilderness Act. Its full title is the National Wilderness Preservation System Act. Working through their representatives in Congress, Americans first saw forest reserves established on federal public lands with the 1891 Forest Reservation Act. Forest reserves were true reserves, closed to grazing, mining, logging, and homesteading. But then Gifford Pinchot, under the influence of German forestry, convinced Congress to open the forest reserves to resource extraction and to grazing as, quote, national forests. That change sparked a national parks movement. Again, working through Congress, Americans bet on national parks to preserve wild nature on public lands. Rapid growth of the National Park Service in the 1920s and 30s saw many new parklands carved out of national forests. But National Park Service Director Stephen Mather soon allied the parks movement with automobile tourism. Roads and other development pressures on backcountry grew, and automobile tourism proliferated. Pressure to road and otherwise develop park backcountry made the drive to protect wilderness by law ever more urgent. The National Park Service Mission 66 program of the 1950s and 60s similarly convinced wilderness advocates to include national parklands in the Wilderness Act and the National Wilderness Preservation System. Mission 66 had recast the Depression-era Civilian Conservation Corps as a 10-year park infrastructure program. And Mission 66 convinced wilderness advocates that wilderness and national parks needed more and better protection. So we have progressed as a nation from forest reserves to national parks and now to the National Wilderness Preservation System. I did not fabricate this history. Its roots persist today in the state of New York's category of forest preserved lands in the Adirondack and Catskill state parks. These lands are protected, quote, forever as wild forest lands. And they're protected by the New York State Constitution. Today, there are 24 state designated wilderness areas in New York. In 1872, the same year that Congress created Yellowstone National Park, New York State established a commission to study creating a state park for the Adirondacks. Why? Because the year before, New York State had found itself for the first time ever as a net importer of wood fiber. So in 1885, New York State designated certain state-owned lands as forest preserve lands. Now that sounds pretty much like forest reserves to come 6 years later on federal public lands. But New York's forest preserve persisted protected. Why? Because it was protected by law, by the state's constitution, not by the whim of administrators. This forever wild clause, as it's known, was one acknowledged model for the 1964 Wilderness Act. To change the status of forest preserve lands requires amending the state constitution, which is a multi-year process that concludes with a public referendum. The state of New York public votes on it. So you see, New Yorkers didn't entrust their wilderness to elected officials, but to the ballot box itself. The father of Wilderness Society founder Robert Marshall, the great civil liberties lawyer Lewis Marshall, he was a voting delegate to the New York State 1894 Constitutional Convention, and he championed the Forever Wild clause. As a convention delegate in 1915, Lewis Marshall led the floor fight that upheld the Forever Wild clause against very powerful political attacks. So New York State succeeded in its own backyard with what the federal government could not make stick on the federal public lands. More than 1 million with the 1891 Forest Reservation Act. New York State now has more than 1 million acres of state wilderness on forest preserve lands in the Adirondack and Catskill regions. So the wilderness preservation movement, even on federal public lands, really dates back to the 19th century. And this also underscores our big idea here. And that is that when talking to the public and to officials about wilderness, undergird your message with our federal public lands conservation history. But what did my father, Howard Zahniser, known as Zahni, what did Zahni mean in terms of the Wilderness Act? What did Zahni mean for the Wilderness Act to mean to you and me today? I think he meant something pretty big. Listen to this language from his 1961 speech, Wilderness Forever, delivered 3 years before the act became law in September 1964. Quote, "It is a bold thing for a human being who lives on the earth but a few score years at most, to presume upon the eternal and covet perpetuity for any of our undertakings, to project into the eternity of the future some of that precious, unspoiled ecological inheritance that has come to us out of the eternity of the past." Now, those words paradoxically marry human boldness with our urgent need for ecological humility. My father had learned newly ecological view of life from Aldo Leopold, Olis Murray, Edward Preble, and others in the Bureau of Biological Survey, which is now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he worked for the Bureau in the 1930s and early 1940s. As he wrote, quote, "We deeply need the humility to know ourselves as the dependent members of a great community of life. To know the wilderness is to know a profound humility, to recognize one's littleness, to sense dependence and interdependence, indebtedness, and responsibility." So wilderness is the Earth's immortal genius. In part, atomic bombs propelled my father full-time into wilderness preservation work in 1945. His active will to move a national politics to preserve wilderness in perpetuity was a humble refusal to see split the dynamic wholeness of the more than human world. As John Hay wrote, "The whole of life is the source of life. Wilderness is not merely landscapes, but it is the earth's immortal genius." Aldo Leopold taught us that the work of creating a land ethic is work to extend the ethical boundaries of the community. As a wilderness worker, that's part of your job description. Leopold made land health a moral issue. To preserve wilderness in perpetuity acknowledges that we are not set apart from the earth's immortal genius. To preserve an enduring resource of wilderness recognizes the proper actual bounds of our true community. And isn't Earth biosphere, in fact, our true community? In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the wilderness movement watched more and more federal public lands get roads for automobile and be methodically carved up and whittled down. That is, modified, to use the verb in the Wilderness Act, to modify America's last great roadless wilderness remnants. Progress, this was called. But as Henry Thoreau observed, 10,000 people shouting the truth automatically makes it false. Wilderness and climate activist Bill McKibben says we need wilderness as one of those few places where we can still sense our true human scale. McKibben compares wilderness to soup kitchens and hospitals as other places where transcendent love still plays. What is our human scale? McKibben says existentially, we are so small, but we can matter so much. That's what the religious sounding language in my father's wilderness writing is about, the boldness of human humility, human biotic humility. And we don't gain humility by seeking it. It works itself into our lives by the discipline of service, like your own work for wilderness and wildness. For us here now, this means the discipline of service to advocate for and to preserve wilderness in Wyoming and throughout the United States. I think this is essentially what Zahni meant with the Wilderness Act, that we might come to know ourselves, as he wrote, as dependent members of an interdependent community of living creatures that together derive their existence from the sun. But what about you? What might you have in mind now? I would like to suggest that you might see yourself in the role of a modern shaman. That is, see yourself as mediating the balance between humans and the more than human world. This wild shaman tradition that you can embody has been here in North America on Turtle Island, as some indigenes call it, since the beginning of time. When the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber wrote out his profoundly relational view of human life in 1923, he included our I-thou relationship with nature. Deep subjectivity with the more than human world was not invented by deep ecology. Look, the world contains many things that exist but cannot be collected and put someplace. The set of complex numbers, gravity, dreams, wilderness, maybe wildness even, because beauty hovers still, as Olaus Murie suggested, without a dollar sign. So you are like the leader of our wild community. We call you wilderness advocate. You have great responsibility in our community, but no authority, except how compelling your message is. We seek better balance between the human community and the more than human world, what we have called nature. Wilderness advocacy for nature, but about culture, means being a voice for mediating and keeping that balance. The Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures verb we translate as to know was often used in a sexual context, not facts, but connection, knowledge, not as accumulation, but as charge and discharge, not a hoard of certainties, not taxonomy, but a release of energy, the dance. It is the livingness we want, a living wilderness, wildness in perpetuity. In his one lifetime of thinking and writing, Aldo Leopold took how we think about nature from seeing so-called game management, like industrial livestock husbandry, all the way to articulating a land ethic whose ethical viewpoint might someday give wildness, for example, legal standing in court. Isn't that amazing? And this is your national conservation heritage. What does it mean to preserve biodiversity? I remember standing as a boy, age 15, on a river bar of the Shinjek River in the Brooks Range, Alaska, in 1961, as Olaus Murie made a cast of a wolf track immaculately pressed into gray glacial river silt like a precious object carved out of metal. Suddenly the rain stopped. Clouds of mosquitoes flew into action. Olaus, hatless and thin of hair, with a gray mix of mud and water putty all over his hands, began gently brushing the mosquitoes off his head so as not to injure them. And I thought, so this is what it means, untrammeled, that odd descriptor of wilderness that my father used in the Wilderness Act, untrammeled by humans. Biodiversity records how life arrived at itself. As a species and individuals, you and I are motile memory, imagining wilderness today. We are the planet remembering itself. At Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, there are plants adapted to live only in specific soils weathered from the exposed strata of one geological formation laid down by ancient seas eons before the dinosaurs arose. And remember how Noah took 2 of each creatures aboard the ark, even those then thought to be ritually unclean. Biodiversity, the whole community of life on Earth. So you are the inheritor not just of 70 years of wilderness thought, but of 7,000 years of reverence for life, of all those before us who have spoken I, thou to nature, who whispered I, thou under the spell of the sensuous. The Wilderness Act redefined progress in line with Thoreau's startling assertion that in wildness is the preservation of the world. And Thoreau uses world in its Greek sense, cosmos spelled with a K, meaning not only world, but also order, pattern, and beauty. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, Thoreau wrote. Wildness is the wellspring for the social conscience declared in Thoreau's essay, Resistance to Civil Government, Opposing Slavery and the War with Mexico. And that writing inspired Mohandas Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So this too is our conservation history. The great Roman poet Horace died 4 years before Jesus of Nazareth was born. In the David Ferry translations of the Odes, Horace records, "Today I have finished a work outlasting bronze and the pyramids of ancient kings. The north wind raging cannot scatter it, nor can the rain obliterate this work, nor can the years, nor can the ages passing. Some part of me will live and not be given over into the hands of the death goddess." The Wilderness Act was crafted by the wilderness community in the 1950s to be, quote, a work outlasting bronze. And that is your legacy in your work for wilderness. The Wilderness Act was crafted, quote, to project into the eternity of the future some of that precious, unspoiled ecological inheritance that has come to us out of the eternity of the past. The Wilderness Act was meant to be a work outlasting bronze. Hear the hope expressed in my father's words, to presume upon the eternal and covet perpetuity. As Doug Scott has said, the early Wilderness Society nucleus made key policy decisions in the 1930s and 40s. 1, wilderness is a natural resource in itself. 2, we need wilderness in a fundamental way. 3, wilderness is imperiled and disappearing, and there is an element of crisis about this. 4, it has to be saved. And 5, when we save wilderness, we are not saving it as a luxury, but in perpetuity, a work outlasting bronze. In 1930, Bob Marshall declared, quote, "There is just one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. That hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness." Now you have joined that spirited people. You now embody that one hope. On behalf of the tradition of our great cloud of witnesses, thank you for what you do and for what you will do to keep on doing, to expand the boundaries of the community, to help people want to neighbor our biosphere, to help people cherish the freedom of the wilderness. So thank you for running your leg of this great wilderness relay race. Thank you for doing your part to preserve the Earth's immortal genius. Now firmly grasp that baton, go forth, do good, and tell the stories, and keep wilderness wild. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed, for your wisdom and your wonderful overview of our wilderness heritage. I know I am inspired, and I hope others in the audience are grasping that baton and ready to join the Wilderness Society and Wyoming Wilderness Association and all the work we are doing to uphold the legacy that Ed just went over so beautifully. Thank you again, Ed. We are now going to move into the section of our evening where we are going to open up the floor for questions. And that could be a question for Ed, Dan Smitherman of the Wilderness Society, or for me from Wyoming Wilderness Association. JJ McGinnis of Wyoming Wilderness Association is going to act as a bit of just an MC, fielding questions if they come through on the chat box, but also making sure that if folks are talking over themselves, we can just have some order and direction on who talks first and things like that. So with that, let's dive in. What are questions that you all have who have shown up to hear our talk this evening?
And I do believe at this time you should have an option to either unmute yourself or you can put questions in the chat and we will get them to the right person, or I believe there's a Q&A option as well, on whatever you are most comfortable with.
Thanks, JJ. Mark Harvey has his hand raised. So Mark, if you go ahead and unmute yourself, you can.
Yes, thank you, Peggy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say quickly, I thought Ed's talk was brilliant. I wrote a biography of Howard Zahniser, but every time I listened to Ed, I learned something new. And I thought it was a fabulous talk. But I have a question of a much more pragmatic nature, which is what's happening with Rock Creek? Where do things stand with the Rock Creek wilderness process?
Mark was with us with Liz Heineman when I got my t-shirt.
So that's a great question, Mark. We have continued to keep Rock Creek on the radar for protection and continue to work on a local level, because at the end of the day, no matter how much support it turns out there is for a landscape, there can be just a few roadblocks at a local level that keep it from moving forward. And so WWA is continuing to work with folks who really want to see it protected as wilderness, as it deserves to be, to try and overcome those who adamantly feel that for whatever reason, it should not have that protection. So it's still on our radar. And hopefully in the coming years, there will be another opportunity for the community to organize and raise their voice in favor of its long-term congressional protection.
Okay.
But at this point, it's being protected as recommended wilderness, which, although it is not that congressional gold standard wilderness protection, it still benefits from many of the same protections that will ensure it stays wild for generations to come. It just doesn't have that perpetuity and insurity that comes with the actual congressional wilderness designation.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking, Mark.
Got a question here. It's, have we lost sight of the importance of BLM wildlands? It's not directed to anyone in particular. So Peggy or Dan, if you want to, or Ed, want to answer this as well, please go ahead.
I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll invite Dan to share his thoughts as well. But to bring awareness, this talk is specific, kind of got its roots in the fact that the Bridger-Teton is coming up. And so we are really trying to rally folks to think about the Bridger-Teton revision plan in regard to our mission. And also the Wilderness Society, I know, was excited to get involved with Ed, but we have not lost sight of BLM wildland protection. There's a lot of work happening across the state of Wyoming to ensure wildlands of the BLM are also protected. But this talk really had its roots in the upcoming forest plan, and that's why we focused on forest planning. But as far as I'm concerned, BLM wildlands are very important and still very relevant in our work. Dan?
Yeah, there's Liz, it's good to see, good to hear from you again. There's a lot of work going on BLM lands. I think Peggy answered the question correctly, in that right now the focus is kind of on the BT, but there's been a lot of work done with the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan, which the Department of Interior has pulled back to look at some of the changes that were made during the Trump administration. The Wyoming Outdoor Council is leading a citizens campaign in the Northern Red Desert, which includes protecting the WSAs there. So there's just as much importance on BLM as there is on Forest Service. It's like Peggy said, it's just a matter of timing.
And I'll add that Wyoming Wilderness Association is a partner on the Citizens for the Red Desert effort, but it's really a citizen-led effort. And if you're interested in learning more about the work on BLM land, Run the Red is an event that we are hosting with NOLS and the Wyoming Outdoor Council. The Wilderness Society is involved, and it's a huge event to celebrate Wyoming Public Lands Day, which is September 25th. And in our follow-up email, I'll put a plug for that if others are interested in learning more about our work on the BLM. If that was Liz Howell who asked that question, hi Liz, and thank you.
I'd like to say that our family was immensely pleased that Mark Harvey wrote our father's biography. And it's a wonderful book. And he later put together an anthology of my father's writing. So if you want to explore the life and the thought, those two books will tell you a lot more than I could ever tell you.
Ed, I've got another question for you here. What do you believe the greatest challenge to additional wilderness designation is today? And how is that different from the obstacles 50 years ago?
50 years ago, that would be what, 1970? I don't know. I don't I don't think the options for wilderness or the opportunity for wilderness greatly changes. It's just that, you know, groups like the Wyoming Wilderness Association, the Wilderness Society, and even state groups in the Adirondacks just have to be eternally vigilant and hold administrators and politicians to the fire. And you always need to be building coalitions. I don't think a lot of people realize that the National Federation of Garden Clubs and other activist women's groups were hugely important in the congressional battle for the Wilderness Act. So, you know, always keep our eyes and ears out for anyone who will throw in and particularly people who already have a lot of political savvy.
All right, thank you, Ed. And if we could now move on for the question slide, we have one more message for everyone in the audience before we let you go. But hopefully you all know that this is start of a conversation, and Dan and myself are happy to continue to ask questions if you think of them down the road, and we're happy to pass some things along to Ed if they come up. But I want to close with the fact that groups like the Wilderness Society and the Wyoming Wilderness Association, although we're working closely together, we're two different groups, and we only exist because people like all of you believe that the work we're doing is important. And if you believe that wilderness is important, if Ed hasn't convinced you, I don't know what would, but hopefully this night has just confirmed your belief that wildlands are worth protecting. And a great way to support the efforts we're doing is the Old Bills Fun Run. It's specific to Teton County, but that includes the Bridger-Teton National Forest and the work we're doing here. And it's a fundraiser where every dollar given will be matched up to 50% if you give before September 17th. So I just want to throw that out as an opportunity for you all to support the work that we're doing for wildlands. And if you just go to oldbills.org, you can look up Wyoming Wilderness Association and the Wilderness Society and support our two groups that are working so hard on this effort. And with that, next slide. Thank you all again so much for being here. Thank you, Ed, for bringing this lovely presentation to the public. And let's all keep in touch. Thanks again for being here. Have a good night.